I'm David Dodge. Welcome to Green Energy Futures. Alberta just hit the unpause button when it comes to renewable energy projects in Alberta. But will the unpause resume the boom in renewable energy investment or drop a poison pill on the industry? We wanted to know what's changed and how it'll impact the industry in Alberta. We're pleased to present our full interview with Dr. Sara Hastings-Simon, an Associate Professor in the Department of Energy and Environment and the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Sara, what just happened when they unpaused renewables in Alberta? A bunch of rules were imposed. Summarize what happened.
So this was the end of a moratorium on the granting of permission for renewable energy projects. And so at the end of this pause now, the AUC, the Alberta Utilities Commission, can go forward and approve projects. And the province also announced a set of new rules, although I would say it was more like describing the rules than really announcing fully fleshed rules. So there's still some details to be worked out.
But what do we know? What are they looking at regulating and getting at?
So we do know the outlines of some of those rules, and there's sort of three big buckets of new rules, and then there was some hinting at further conversations to come. But the three big areas of new rules are, one is around land use and prohibition of projects that don't allow for continued agricultural use on Class 1 and Class 2 lands. The second is about locating projects near what the province is calling pristine viewscapes and protected areas. A lot of questions there, but basically saying, that there's going to be some controls about how close they can be placed to various things like protected areas, but also presumably, mountains and those kinds of things. And then the third was around reclamation, so requirements for securities or bonding. Again, there not a lot of details on exactly how that will work. Many of these projects are already have this kind of reclamation planning as part of them. Many, if not, in fact, probably all. So some questions there still about how that will come, and then some hinting at some future changes around. They talked about transmission. They didn't really make it explicit, but to me it sounds like talking about transmission charges for renewable energy, and then talking about kind of market rules more generally, as there is a kind of ongoing conversation around design of Alberta's market.
So overall, is this just about regulating the industry and stuff that should have been done, or what's the big picture?
I think the big picture, in order to really understand that, you have to understand it within the big picture of regulation of the energy industry as a whole, so other forms of energy included. And when I look there, I think that it's fair to say that in Alberta, we have not done a good job of regulating our energy industry. We have massive outstanding liabilities that we know of within, say, the conventional oil and gas sector. We have problems of orphaned wells. And these were all things that the province and the government sort of hinted at when they talked about the reason for doing this. And so the case to really take a serious look and, regulate the energy industry, I think, is strong. I think the challenge, or, I look at what's come out now, and it feels like this is less of a, let's regulate industry overall, and more of a sort of direct constraints and prohibitive constraints being placed on one specific sector within energy, that being renewables. And, if there isn't a move within very short time to create similar rules across the energy sector as a whole, then I think that's the right way to understand what's going on here, or what has happened here.
Let's deal with each of the issues one by one. So I know agricultural land was one of the reasons it was cited as initiating the pause, and they've talked about some changes that will come as a result of that. But I also know that you did a quick study about the impact of renewables on land. What did you learn, and how will this change what's been happening?
So what we looked at was really just trying to understand the scale of the problem, right? The concern is basically, are we using up farmland that we need to grow food in order to host solar and wind projects? Wind projects typically have more agricultural activities going on around them, so it's more of a concern on the solar side. And so in order to answer that question, the scale is really quite important, right? So to kind of take two extreme examples, if you were talking about, putting solar projects on 50% of our agricultural land, then I think, yes, we would have to, really seriously ask, how is this going to impact food production? And in fact, there are examples within ethanol, which is much less land efficient than solar, where you did have a problem of energy crops basically sort of, pushing out or having an impact on agricultural crops. But the reality in Alberta, when it comes to sort of the amount of land that we have and the amount of renewables that we're talking about, is that I think there's much less of a reason for concern. So, on a total agricultural land availability measure, we're talking about solar, in some kind of 2035 future of less than 0.1% of the agricultural land that we have overall. And so, I think that I'll be interested to see the province and the AUC has sort of made these rule changes on the basis of a report that the AUC was meant to provide to the province. We haven't seen a copy of that report. I think it would be very helpful to see, what the AUC said about the land issues. But the way that the rules sound, that's the one where the rules seem the most clear, which is a basically blanket prohibition on solar on Class 1 and Class 2 agricultural lands where you don't have a dual use. So you're not able to, use that land still for agriculture in some way. And now we can ask what the impact that is on the sector. And currently we haven't seen, or at least as far as I'm aware, we haven't seen any renewable projects being developed on Class 1 land. And I think that's a reflection of, these are projects landowners get to choose whether or not they want to enter into a contract and whether or not they want to host these projects on their land. It's not like the oil and gas where, because it's provincially owned, there's a requirement that you just have to take these projects if they come. And so, reasonably, it seems that landowners are saying, no, it doesn't make sense to put these projects on Class 1 land. That land I want to use to, farm for its agricultural purposes. The Class 2 land, which is, slightly less suitable, but still considered good for crop growing with irrigation, is the one where I think this gets a little bit trickier. Of the existing solar projects that we have, it seems that about 15% are on this type of land. And so I don't think that, it's going to completely prevent renewable development to prevent projects on Class 2 land. But I do think that it will have, some impact on pricing as you have less land available. So there's, less competition, prices will go up slightly. But I think also for landowners, there's a real question of, what is the justification for government to be so directive of what they're doing with their land in a way that we really don't do for other types of choices that landowners are making. And especially in a year where we know that we're facing really quite a dramatic drought. And, I think that there is going to be likely to be limitations on water that's available for irrigation. It seems challenging to tell a landowner, you're not allowed to make the choice that hosting solar on your land is the right thing for, as long as you meet all the other requirements. Obviously, there's all kinds of rules in place, but just the use of the land, that you're not able to make that choice. And you may or may not have water available to irrigate that land to actually be able to grow crops on it. And it is not, if the argument is like, do we have enough land to, produce enough resources and nutrients? Where do we draw that line? We don't tell landowners what types of crops they're allowed to grow. We don't tell them that they can't grow ethanol, which is a much lower yield in terms of energy and also takes away cropland. We don't tell them, you have to grow more nutritious or higher caloric crops versus lower caloric crops. So again, it's sort of, it begs the question of, why in this specific case are we regulating in this way? And the threat or the risk of the using up of agricultural land just doesn't seem to be there in order to justify it.
Let's move to liability and reclamation. What's happening there? And what's happening there?
So on liabilities, we got a sketch of a plan, although there's still more details to be filled in. So basically it said that renewable energy developers will have to provide either a bond or a security to pay for reclamation for basically cleanup at end of lifetime. Although they did leave the door open for a sort of different type of agreement negotiated through the contract. So again, it's really hard to say, that could be implemented in a way that's quite expensive, right? So if you basically were to require, the full money down upfront before the project even gets built, that could create a hurdle for developers in terms of that's an extra cost that basically you're paying upfront, and because of discounting and the time value of money, that becomes more expensive. It could be done in a way that is, workable. And as I said, the majority of these projects, are entering into responsible agreements where there are reclamation funding available. And of course, we've seen now the very first wind farm in Alberta that reached its end of life, which was, decommissioned and taken down appropriately. The challenge, especially on the wind side, is a bit different than with oil and gas. And so, certainly we do need to ensure companies are going to be responsible, but an oil and gas well at the end of its life is only a liability. You basically just need to make an investment in order to close it properly. A wind farm, while you may need to take down the turbines, is still located in a good place that still has a good wind resource. The resource is still there. The transmission connection would still be there. And so there would be a big incentive to basically, reinvest. And as part of that reinvestment, do the decommissioning of projects. And the other thing that I would just observe is, again, it's a question of, should we be better dealing with end-of-life liability for energy projects in Alberta? Unequivocally, yes. We have dropped the ball over decades on this and continue to, in terms of the size of the orphan wells that we have, outstanding liabilities in the oil sands, as well as things like, companies not paying their municipal taxes in a timely manner. So we are definitely not being as strict as we need to be on regulation of the energy industry. But the question is, why would we then fix that by only applying it to one small sector of the energy industry? And so again, having these rules in place, I think as long as they're part of a broader reformation of the reclamation project is a good thing for Albertans. But if it's done purely for the renewable sector, while we leave the rest of the energy sector alone, it's really best understood as more of a sort of punitive kind of targeting of that sector.
So to be clear, if I understand this, after 20 years on a solar farm, the best reclamation plan is probably to refresh the solar panels with more efficient ones and make more money.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And that's very different from an oil well or gas well where it might just not be producing very much anymore. The sun will still be there, and the transmission interconnection too.
Let's go to another one of the factors that we heard quite a bit about in talk about the moratorium and lifting the moratorium. And that is, we heard several different times that renewable energy is not reliable. So how do you answer that?
It comes, I think, as no surprise to anybody that the sun goes down at the end of the day. And the renewable energy industry is well aware of this. When we talk about the role that renewables have to play in a reliable, resilient, and efficient electricity grid, we have to think a little bit more deeply than just there are some times when the sun isn't shining. And so renewables, I think nobody is proposing to have a grid in Alberta that's based solely on wind and solar. At the same time, we actually have a lot more hours of the year when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing than one might, I think, sort of come up with if you just had to guess. And so in some of my research, we find that, you could reach a grid that is 60 or even 70% renewables on an annual basis at a really cost-effective level. And so when we think about, the role of renewables in reliability, and in particular, the issue that we saw with the emergency alert in Alberta, it's easy to sort of point a figure at, what wasn't generating at that time. Of course, it was a very challenging moment. We have these alerts in moments of system stress. So we had very cold temperatures, sort of record high or very high demand. At the same time, we had some thermal plants, some natural gas plants that were offline. And then, of course, during the day, we were actually fine because the solar was producing. And it was that period just after the sun went down, basically, poor people went to sleep, or we were risking that shortfall. And so, part of the answer to that in the near term is to say, what resources can we bring online to give us a little bit more wiggle room there? Energy storage, if you're talking about, a few hours, that's really a great resource to have. But we really need to think about planning our grid and what are all of those elements, that combination of dispatchable resources still for some time, but renewables, storage, demand response, and transmission interconnection. And that's what's going to give us a reliable electricity. Our grid in general is built off the principle that no single resource can be, guaranteed to show up when you need it. And that's true of all types of energy resources. They just provide different types of challenges. So we know when the sun is going to go down and we can plan for that. We need to manage that. We know that sometimes a thermal plant is going to break and we need to plan for and manage that as well.
So if we grow our grid with renewables to some of the percentages you were alluding to, it can be cheaper or more expensive. How does that work? And storage doesn't come in just short term. I understand we have a flow battery project that just went in Cold Lake, and there is some pump storage work being done, I believe, by TransAlta. So it's probably, and smart grid technologies, there's lots we need to do. Are we doing those things to help facilitate these renewables that are actually coming?
We're not doing them as much as we need to be, right? And that's a problem, not only for renewable integration, but really also because it just means people are going to be paying more than they need to, right? And so, the really expensive part of providing electricity, it's not the same in every hour of the day. That the part that sort of costs the most on the grid and that costs the most for consumers in their electricity bill is meeting the demand at the peak when you have the highest demand for electricity and the lowest amount of resources providing that. And so you have the ability to, and people that have lived in other parts of Canada may be familiar with sort of the, let's call it demand response 1.0 version here, which is basically you have a lower electricity price overnight. And so people may be in the habit of, setting a timer on their dishwasher or their washing machine to run overnight because you wake up, your dishes are still clean and you paid a bit less for them. The opportunity that we have now, as we are both starting to add more demand for electricity on our grid, say in the form of electric vehicles or hot water heating, at the same time that we have much more technology that allows us to communicate with the grid, is that we can find ways to actually send people, or preferably actually just send directly their devices, signals about when it's a cheaper or more expensive time to use energy. And charging an electric vehicle is a perfect example of that. There you have quite a lot of flexibility. You probably, in most cases, don't care what time your car is charging overnight, as long as it has power when you wake up. And so making sure that we're able to have grid operators who can look and see, well, right now is a very expensive time to be charging this car. We expect it's going to be cheaper in 2 hours. They can send a signal to the car. If for some reason you were starting your road trip, David, at 3 a.m, you could override it and say, nope, I need to be ready to go then. But in most cases, you would be able to shift that. And that's a way to really capture a lot of, or take care of a lot of what I would call almost waste in our system that we have today. That's only going to become more important as we both integrate more renewables, so we get more of that variability, but also as we electrify more of the ways that we're using energy. And so we're bringing on these bigger loads, some of them with quite a lot of flexibility.
I was just on a panel a couple of days ago with representatives of two of our bigger utilities, and they both made it seem like we already know what to do and we can use these EVs and the energy from the EVs and shift it around. And they made it sound like we already know what to do. Why aren't we doing this?
Good question. Yeah, to some extent we do, right? I think there's always work to be done to kind of understand how best to interact with consumers, how much of an incentive you need to give them so that people are willing to shift, and what's a fair sharing of that. But this is not about, new breakthrough technologies. This is really about doing things that in many other parts of the world we are doing. And so one of the challenges really right now is still just the rules and infrastructure. So in some parts of the province, we have smart meters. So in order to do this kind of so-called time of use, basically trying to control and measure when people are using electricity, you have to know not just the total amount of electricity that they've used over the month, but you have to know when that was used. I have to know if you did, not charge your car during that hour when I told you that it was going to be very expensive to do so. And so in big parts of the province, we don't actually even have meters with this capability, or we don't have the ability to read that information from them. So there's a bit more work that needs to be done to kind of upgrade that infrastructure. It's an area where honestly we lag a lot of a lot in North America, which has seen those meters be installed. But then also we need to have some, changes to the rules to make sure that the way that utilities kind of charge consumers for electricity and the way that they recover those costs are shifted to allow for this to happen. So it's not that we have necessarily prohibitions against it, but we don't have, kind of the clear rules that make it, that facilitate that kind of offering.
And I really shouldn't say this because we should keep going. But my understanding is at least a third of Albertans do have smart meters. The Edmonton area apparently has the technology in place.
Yeah, that's right. So you're getting my Calgary biased view when I say we don't have smart meters, because we don't have smart meters down here in Calgary. But you're right that Edmonton did roll out smart meters. So you do have a significant portion of the population that has that. I just don't want you guys to start this in Edmonton without us getting to start it here in Calgary too.
I only know this because I sit around the fire every Friday night with the guy who did that.
Okay. Well, kudos to him. He just needs to get the rest of the province on board now.
Okay, last area that was addressed, and that is the Premier's identified some areas that are, and some regulations or whatever that's going to be coming that'll say where you can't do renewable energy projects. Tell me about what's happening there.
I think this is the one that has the largest potential to limit development, depending on how exactly it's designed. And so the announcement talked about a 35-kilometer buffer zone around so-called protected areas and pristine viewscapes. I would say that's a pretty large buffer zone compared to, the kinds of rules that we've seen in other places. Obviously, there are rules. You can't put a wind turbine on top of someone's house. So we do have rules that, set these back from where people are living. But this is quite a large distance. And so, depending how that's interpreted, if you just take kind of today's protected areas, it looks like that will be up to 3/4, for example, of the land in southern Alberta, where you would expect to see a lot of wind and solar developed, will be off limits. And that, gets then further limited when you think about where is the transmission availability as well, too, once you've sort of blocked out large parts of the province. And so, another one we're definitely waiting to hear more about how exactly these rules will apply. Again, a lot of sort of seems to be different treatment of different types of energy industries. So at the same, basically in the same week, we've heard that the provincial government wants to reopen the grassy coal mine application. So open pit mining of coal in the mountains is sort of on the table. So again, sort of different treatment of different types of energy infrastructure when it comes to being located in or near protected areas or areas that we think of as, having a natural beauty. And also, I think really concerning to me, the government was asked and the minister confirmed that they don't have a definition of pristine viewscapes. And I think that is a very subjective kind of term. And, it leads you to ask, well, who's pristine viewscape? Who's making that judgment of when something is pristine and whose views deserve to be protected? And so I think that when you have that kind of very subjective measurement, it's open for a lot of bias in interpretation of how it's applied differently in, different communities or different areas. And so I think that's a bit concerning, even aside from kind of this question of, applied broadly, it could really, I think, dramatically limit the places that you could put renewables to the point that we would see significantly less investment. But moreover, it could do it in a way that really creates sort of an inequality across communities in Canada or in Alberta.
Do you think this is reasonable, Sara? Because if I think about our conventional industries, there are literally thousands of oil wells within viewscapes inside protected areas. Is this a fairness thing? And especially when you consider the fact that the biggest global issue we're facing right now is climate change.
Yeah, I think you're spot on both points, right? Again, it's, should we have areas of nature that we say we don't want to develop because we want to keep them, without a human footprint, right? I think that's a reasonable conversation to have, but only in the context of all types of development that can happen in that region, because again, otherwise you're sort of picking on one and you have other infrastructure that you're looking at there. The other one is sort of a deeper question of, if it's about protecting nature, how do we do that, and how do we think about the the need to develop responsibly lower carbon and lower footprint, less emitting sources of energy, compared with the need to decarbonize to ensure that we're not having the impacts of climate change really decimate, nature through that channel as well too. And so it's, there's not I don't think that in this case, I don't think science, or you can't sit down and do the analysis and sort of come up with a number of, well, this is the right amount of development, or here's how close it should be to the mountains. It's always going to be a discussion. But I think that discussion needs to both start from the standpoint of talking about all infrastructure development and talking about trade-offs in terms of impacts on climate. And it seems that we're sort of leaving those two out. It's really just about the impact of seeing renewable energy projects only, and what that does to some of our natural areas.
So before we get to our last question, do you think that's this whole discussion around viewscapes and protected areas and giant buffer zones, is that a poison pill for renewable energy?
I think it could be, right? Again, I think we don't yet have enough information to know exactly how that will be implemented. So if it was implemented in sort of the broadest sense, where you took, all the designated protected areas and drew those buffer zones and added in, the ability for people to designate additional viewscapes, I think it would rise to the level of a poison pill. I guess that it'll, we'll have to see kind of how that's intending to be implemented before we can really say more. Which kind of gets back to what I was saying earlier on, which is that we don't really, yes, the moratorium has ended and projects that are waiting for their approvals will be able to go ahead. But I think if you're a proponent with a new project, that level of uncertainty is not enough to get you to make the investments that you need to make in order to move your projects forward. And so I think until we get some more certainty about these rules and how the rules will be applied, we may not have a moratorium on projects that have applied, but we'll have a de facto moratorium on people making investments to develop new projects.
What puzzles me is, aren't conservative governments supposed to be for economic development, for investment? The Pembina Institute estimated $33 billion worth of projects were put on hold with the moratorium. Do you think that had an impact on investment in Alberta? And what impact do you think all of this uncertainty will have on future investment? We were just getting ready and in fact, in the position of leading this industry in Canada. What's going to happen?
So I think it's impossible to imagine that this won't have an impact on investment, right? And investors are looking, they have options across Canada, across North America, and other regions as well, where they might build out renewable energy. And many of the renewable energy companies that are developing projects in Alberta have a Canadian and global footprint. So they will be, comparing different regions and looking at the rules and making decisions based on, level of risk that they see or cost for the rules that are implied. I think the exact impact is a little bit going to be a wait and see in terms of both how quickly these rules get defined so that we can see projects moving forward again, and then looking to see kind of, how developers kind of decide to re-enter the market or what kind of risks they see going forward. So I'll certainly be watching carefully, what happens with projects that are entering the queue and so forth. But to your earlier point of sort of how does this meet, again, there does seem to be very many ways, if we think about something like red tape reduction, which has also been a big push from this government, getting into the, minutia of what an individual landowner, what kind of resources they're allowed to develop on their land, that strikes me as much more adding of red tape. So it does seem, again, like this specific industry is being singled out in a way that's very different from other industries. And I think it begs the question of, what is the justification for that and why is that? And I don't think that we've really heard an answer to that.
I'm going to end with one more question that's along the same lines, Sara. Alberta got to the point of leading the country, building 75% of the renewable energy projects in the country in 1 year. I think that was 2022, without any institutional support, without, except for a couple of lucky regulations that really serve this well. What could we do if we actually decided to encourage and support these industries?
So I'll first say that there was actually some government policy and action that was important, I think, in getting us to that point, right? And that was not, as you say, direct funding of projects. And I still, feel like I am constantly meeting people, and I have to explain that renewable energy projects are not getting subsidies in Alberta. It's almost like unbelievable. But the former government, the former NDP government, when they brought in the Renewable Energy Procurement Program, so that was a procurement of just a handful of projects that the government of Alberta basically owns the offtake, owns the energy for. And I think that actually was really critical in kind of launching this market, putting Alberta on the map as, developers. It's sort of sad to say, but I think many just outside of the country, didn't realize we were here, didn't know that we had this open electricity market, and didn't know that we had a good wind and solar resource. And so we were able to put Alberta on the map. And as a result of that, policy, which not only did not come as a cost to taxpayers, but actually is paying money back to taxpayers because of what we'd seen happen to power prices. That was really critical. And then the industry, because of the economics and because of the Alberta's resources, was able to move forward without any additional support. When I think about what's needed, aside from not having moratoriums, what's needed to ensure that we continue to have a healthy and vibrant renewable energy industry in Alberta, it's again not really on the direct subsidy or direct support side. These are very competitive projects. They don't need additional subsidies to make the economics work. But what does need to happen is a review of the way that we design and build transmission lines, both within the province and also between Alberta and our neighbors. And so we've been able to connect all of these renewable energy projects without having to build out new transmission infrastructure. We've had the capacity to do so. But as we develop more projects, there will be a time where we need to have some additional investment in transmission. And for that, I look at, Texas sort of took the transmission planning model and put it on its head, rather than using this model that's designed for large thermal projects, where basically a project proponent makes a case for why you need to build a transmission line exactly to them. What Texas did was say is, we know that we have regions that have a lot of renewables. Some of them are a little bit further from our population centers or our uses of energy. And so we need to build out transmission lines to those regions, but in a way that then allows for competition. And so they identified those regions, they built those transmission lines, and then they had massive investment, private investment in building out renewable energy. And so I think that is a lesson Alberta could take. And frankly, I think with a federal government that is pushing for decarbonization of the electricity sector, that's something that the province could go to the feds with and say, we want your help and we want your support, and we want your money to help us to build these projects so that we can bring more transmission and bring more renewables online for Albertans. And similar when you think about connecting BC and Alberta. If BC wants a bunch of new renewable energy, the cheapest thing that they could do would be to have that energy built, those wind and solar projects built in Alberta. We have a much better wind and solar resource than they do. And so we could, be exporting more of our energy to market through new interprovincial transmission lines. So that's the big area that I'm looking at, aside from when we talked about with the demand response. But when you're talking about big infrastructure investments, it's those transmission lines. And I think that's something that, Alberta has a good case to make to ask the feds for support. And as an Albertan, I would be very happy. I think that would be money well spent, and we would be well supported to have the federal government making those investments.
Yeah, and I think that's what I meant by support and encourage, not incentives, but support.
Exactly.
Like encouragement, applying to the feds, leveraging this with the feds, as you suggested, to get new transmission lines to BC or whatever. Imagine what could happen.
A lot of opportunity there, right?
Thanks, Sara. Thank you very much for your help in this analysis. I really appreciate it. It seems pretty clear. We could go on forever. I think that's plenty. So thank you very much. We'll talk again.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for having me.